The dust tasted of endings. Alara coughed, a dry, hopeless sound lost in the vast, sun-bleached expanse of the territory. Every bone in her body ached with a weariness that went deeper than the miles she'd walked. Her boots, worn through to the soles, offered little protection from the baked earth. In her pocket, her fingers worried the edge of a creased, sweat-stained scrap of paper pulled from a post in the last town. Farmhand wanted, it read. Hard work, fair pay, Blackwood Ranch. It didn't say men only. That was the single thread she clung to. The Blackwood Ranch wasn't just a piece of land, it was a kingdom carved from the wilderness. The main house stood on a low rise, a two-story timber assertion against the endless sky, flanked by a barn big enough to swallow a church, and a web of corrals that seemed to stretch for a mile. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a lonely signal of life in the immense quiet. As she drew closer, the sheer scale of the operation was intimidating. This was the domain of a powerful man, and she was a ghost, a woman with nothing but a name she couldn't use and a past that was hunting her. A man with a face like a dried apple and shoulders stooped from a lifetime of labor stopped sharpening a blade as she approached the barn. His eyes, small and suspicious, took in her ragged dress, the dust caked on her skin, and the desperate set of her jaw. "Lost, miss?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. It wasn't a kind question. Alara swallowed against the dust in her throat. She held out the scrap of paper. "I'm here about the work." The man, Jed, as she would learn he was called, actually laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of a sound, devoid of humor. "The work's for a hand, not a lady." He spat the last word like it was a foul taste. "The notice says farmhand," she insisted, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've got two hands. They've seen more work than you can imagine." It was a foolish thing to say, a spark of defiance she couldn't afford, but she was too tired for humility. Jed was about to reply, his mouth already forming a dismissal, when a shadow fell over them. A man emerged from the barn, tall and broad, moving with a quiet authority that silenced the world around him. He didn't seem to walk, he seemed to command the ground to meet his boots. This had to be Blackwood. His face was hard angles and shadows, dominated by eyes the color of a winter sky. Grief had carved lines around them, but it hadn't softened him. It had turned him to iron. He looked from Jed to Alara, his gaze lingering on the scrap of paper in her hand. "What is it?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "She's answering the ad, Mr. Blackwood," Jed said, a note of disbelief in his tone. Silas Blackwood's eyes settled on her, and for a moment, Alara felt like a page he was reading. Every line of her desperation and fear laid bare. He saw the warrant in her posture, the hunger in her cheeks. She held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. It was all she had left. "The ad's for a man," he stated, his voice flat, final. "The ad's for a hand," she repeated, her own voice barely a whisper. "One who isn't afraid of work. I can mend fence, muck a stall, and I'm stronger than I look." He was silent for a long time, his face unreadable. He was a man who had locked every door to his soul and thrown away the keys. She saw the damage in him, a cold, banked fire of old pain. He was about to send her on her way. She could see the refusal forming on his lips. But then his gaze drifted past her, toward a distant corral where a magnificent black stallion paced like a caged storm. A flicker of something, pain, memory, crossed his face before the mask of indifference slammed back down. "There's a line shack out past the north pasture," he said, his voice clipped. "Jed will show you. You'll be on trial. 1 week. You don't keep up. You're gone." He didn't offer kindness, only a reprieve. He turned and walked back into the barn without another word, leaving her standing in the dust, breathing again for the first time in what felt like days. He hadn't asked for her name. It was better that way. The line shack was little more than a box against the wind. It had a cot, a rickety table, and a stove that looked like it would either suffocate her with smoke or not light at all. But it had a door with a latch and 4 solid walls. To Alara, it was a palace. Jed left her with a bucket of water, a side of bacon, and a sack of flour. "Work starts before dawn," he grunted, and left her alone with the sighing of the prairie wind. That night, for the first time in months, she slept without one ear open for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She slept under the protection of a man who didn't want her there, and it was the safest she had ever felt. The work was brutal. From sunup to sundown, she dug post holes until her hands were raw, her palms blistering and then bleeding. She repaired sections of fence under the relentless sun, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the morning sounds of men and horses, the smell of coffee and bacon from the cookhouse she wasn't invited to, the weary silence of dusk. The other hands watched her, their expressions a mixture of pity and scorn. They expected her to break. Every morning she showed up, her hands wrapped in strips torn from her petticoat, her face set. They seemed more surprised. Silas Blackwood was a constant, distant presence. She would see him on the porch of the main house, a dark silhouette against the morning light, or riding the fence line on a powerful bay gelding. He never spoke to her. He never acknowledged her beyond a curt nod if their paths crossed, but she felt his eyes on her. When she was struggling to lift a heavy rail, she'd feel a prickling on her neck and know he was watching from a rise. He wasn't watching to see if she would succeed. He was watching for the moment she would fail. She was determined to disappoint him. Her one solace was the horses. The ranch was full of them, sturdy quarter horses with intelligent eyes. They didn't judge her past or her gender. They responded to the quiet in her, the patience in her touch. And then there was the stallion, Shadow. He was kept in a reinforced corral far from the other horses, a creature of midnight silk and furious energy. The hands gave him a wide berth. They said he was a devil, that he'd killed a man once. They said he'd been the late Mrs. Blackwood's horse, and that he'd gone mad with grief the day she died. Ilara didn't see a devil. She saw a heart broken in the same way her own was, a spirit that raged against its cage because it didn't know what else to do. One evening, after her work was done, she walked out to his corral. She didn't approach the fence. She just sat in the dust, a good 20 yards away, and hummed a low, tuneless song her mother used to sing. The stallion stopped his frantic pacing. He threw his head up, nostrils flaring, and stared at her, his dark eyes burning with suspicion. He snorted, a plume of dust rising from the ground, but he didn't charge. He just watched. She came back the next night and the night after that. She never tried to touch him, never tried to force anything. She just offered him her quiet presence. She'd talk to him sometimes, her voice soft, telling him about the clouds, about the ache in her back, about nothing at all. He began to anticipate her visits. He would be waiting by the far fence, watching the path from the line shack. The frantic energy seemed to bleed out of him, replaced by a tense curiosity. One afternoon, a storm rolled in fast, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled and rain came down in silver sheets. The hands scrambled to get the herd into the lower pasture. Ilara was helping when a bolt of lightning struck a cottonwood near Shadow's corral. The crack was deafening. The stallion screamed, a sound of pure terror, and began to throw himself against the rails, his eyes rolling white. "He'll kill himself!" Jed yelled over the wind. "No one can get near him like this." The men backed away, helpless. Silas was there, his face a mask of grim anguish. That horse was the last living piece of his wife, and he was watching it destroy itself. Without thinking, Alara started walking toward the corral. "Woman! Get back here!" Jed shouted. "Are you crazy?" She didn't listen. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the terrified animal. She began to hum that same low, tuneless song, her voice carrying faintly on the wind. The stallion paused in his frantic rearing, his ears twitching toward the sound. She reached the fence and slipped between the rails. Silas took a step forward, his mouth open to shout, but something stopped him. He watched as this slip of a woman, soaked to the bone, walked into the heart of the storm he'd built around his grief. She didn't approach the stallion's head. She moved to his side, slowly, murmuring to him, "Easy now, big fellow. It's just noise. Just weather. We've seen worse, you and I." She laid a hand on his trembling, rain-slicked neck. The horse flinched but didn't pull away. He stood, quivering, as she stroked him, her touch firm and gentle. She leaned her forehead against his side, the rain plastering her hair to her face, and just stood with him, a small island of calm in the chaos. The great, violent beast quieted, his breathing slowing to match hers. The storm in him was over long before the storm in the sky passed. The rain softened to a drizzle. The men stood in stunned silence. Silas Blackwood stared, the iron mask on his face cracked wide open. He wasn't looking at a farmhand. He was looking at a miracle. He had watched the best horseman in the territory try and fail to get within 10 feet of that stallion. And this woman, this stranger, had walked through a wall of fear and rage with nothing but a song and a steady hand. He saw her not as a liability, but as someone who understood a language of loss that he himself had forgotten how to speak. Her week-long trial came and went. No one mentioned it. Her place at the Blackwood Ranch, it seemed, was no longer temporary. She was still in the line shack, still doing the work of 2 men, but something had shifted. The other hand started to nod at her in the morning. Jed once left a piece of apple pie on her doorstep. They were small gestures, but on the vast, lonely prairie, they felt like monuments. Silas began to change, too. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. He started taking his morning coffee on the porch at the same time she walked from her shack to the barn, and he would watch her until she disappeared inside. One day, he rode out to the fence line where she was working. He didn't dismount, just sat his horse, watching her expertly stretch and tie off a wire. "Your hands," he said. His voice was still rough, but the hard edge was gone. She looked down at her palms. The blisters had become calluses, crisscrossed with small, healing cuts. "They're used to it." "I have salve at the house," he offered, almost gruffly. "For the horses. It'll work for you." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I'm fine." He nodded, a short, sharp movement. The stallion. Shadow. "My wife." She raised him from a colt. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife to anyone in years. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. "He misses her," Ilara said softly. "He's just lonely." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and she knew he wasn't just talking about the horse anymore. He was talking about the cavernous silence in the main house, the empty chair at the supper table, the cold side of the bed. He was the stallion in the corral, pacing the fence line of his own grief. He turned his horse and rode off without another word, but the conversation echoed in the silence he left behind. A few days later, she found a small tin of salve sitting on the rail of her porch. There was no note. None was needed. She used it that night, the sharp, clean scent of pine and lanolin filling her small cabin. It was a kindness, an acknowledgement. It was terrifying. Kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. It made her want things she could never have. It made her want to stay. The slow burn of their connection was built in these quiet moments. He found her in the barn late one night, fast asleep in the hay near Shadow's stall, a book lying open on her chest. She had fallen asleep reading by the light of a single lantern. He stood there for a long time, just watching the way her chest rose and fell, the exhaustion smoothed from her face in sleep. He gently took the book, marking her page with a piece of straw, and then removed his heavy wool coat and draped it over her. He lingered for a second, his fingers brushing a stray piece of hair from her cheek, a touch so light she didn't stir. He left before she could wake, but when she did, she was wrapped in the scent of leather, wood smoke, and him. She held the coat to her face and inhaled, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the wool. One of the ranch cows gave birth to a sickly calf. It was small and weak, its breathing shallow. Jed declared it a lost cause. "Best to put it out of its misery," he said, his voice practical. "No," Alara said, stepping forward. "Let me try." She carried the little animal to a warm stall, wrapping it in blankets. She remembered things her grandmother had taught her, old knowledge of herbs and roots. She made a brew from willow bark and yarrow she found growing by the creek, and patiently coaxed the warm liquid down the calf's throat. Silas found her there in the pre-dawn hours, sitting on the floor of the stall, the calf's head in her lap. Its breathing was stronger, its eyes a little brighter. He didn't say anything. He just went and came back with 2 tin cups of coffee, hot and black. He handed one to her and sat down on a hay bale nearby. They drank in silence, watching the first pale light of dawn creep into the barn. The air was thick with unspoken things. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the comfortable quiet of 2 people who understood each other without the need for words. "You have a way with broken things," he said at last, his eyes on the calf. "Maybe I'm just broken in the same places," she replied, her voice soft. The moment stretched, fragile and real. He looked like he wanted to say more, but one of the hands called his name from the yard, and the spell was broken. He stood, gave her a long, searching look, and left. But the warmth of the shared coffee, the intimacy of that quiet moment, stayed with her all day. He began to invent reasons to be near her. He decided the ranch needed a new smokehouse, and he set about building it himself, asking her to help him measure and hold the timbers. They worked side by side for days, the simple act of building something together a balm for their separate hurts. His hand would brush hers as he passed her a tool. He'd stand a little too close as he explained how to notch a log. The air between them crackled with a tension that was both agonizing and exquisite. One afternoon, he was teaching her to rope, a skill she'd never mastered. He stood behind her, his chest a warm, solid presence against her back. He guided her arms, his large, calloused hands covering hers on the rope. "It's in the wrist," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her neck. "Don't fight it. Feel the weight." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies, the strength in his arms, the clean, masculine scent of him. She forgot how to breathe. She threw the rope, and by some miracle, it settled perfectly over the practice post. "See?" he said, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "You're a fast learner." He didn't move away. For a long moment they stood there, wrapped in the coils of the rope and the invisible tether that had grown between them. He slowly turned her to face him. His winter eyes were no longer cold. They were dark with an emotion she didn't dare name. He lifted a hand, as if to touch her face, but then a shout from the corral pulled him back to himself. He dropped his hand, stepping back so quickly it felt like a rejection. The space between them was suddenly a chasm again. "Enough for today," he said, his voice strained. He turned and walked away, leaving her with the phantom warmth of his body against hers and a heart that ached with a terrifying, impossible hope. She was falling in love with Silas Blackwood, a man whose name she shouldn't know, in a place she couldn't stay. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was going to destroy her. The world outside the sanctuary of the Blackwood Ranch continued to turn, and eventually, it turned in her direction. A man named Finch rode into the nearby town of Redemption. He wasn't a lawman, not officially, but a bounty hunter, a species of man who thrived on the misery of others. He had a weasel's face and eyes that saw everything in terms of its price. In his saddlebag was a faded, hand-drawn poster with a likeness of a woman named Elara Vance, wanted for the murder of a prominent landowner in Kansas. The reward was substantial. Finch started asking questions in the saloon, his voice oily and insinuating. Had anyone seen a woman matching the description? Young, with haunted eyes, looks like she's been running for a long time. The bartender, who knew the Blackwood Ranch had recently hired a woman, said nothing, but his silence was loud enough. Gossip in a town like Redemption was a contagion, and it spread fast. Jed was in town for supplies when he heard the whispers. He saw the drawing Finch slid across the bar. His blood ran cold. He rode back to the ranch like he was being chased by the devil himself. He found Silas by the new smokehouse, sanding a door. "We need to talk, boss," Jed said, his face grim. He didn't waste time. "There's a bounty hunter in town, a man named Finch. He's looking for a woman, name of Elara Vance, wanted for murder." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The drawing. It's her. It's the woman you hired." Silas stopped sanding. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wood. The iron mask slammed back into place, colder and harder than ever before. Every moment of warmth, every shared silence, every almost touch, turned to ash in his mind. He had allowed himself to feel something, to hope for something, and it had been a lie. He had let a killer into his home, near his memories, near the fragile, healing part of himself. He found her by Shadow's corral, speaking softly to the stallion. The horse, once a symbol of his untamable grief, was now calm under her touch, a testament to the lie she represented. He felt a fool. "Jed was in town," he said. His voice was devoid of all emotion, a flat, dead thing. Elara turned, a smile touching her lips at the sight of him. The smile died when she saw his face. She knew, instantly, that her time was up. The world had found her. "There's a man asking questions," he continued, his eyes like chips of ice. "A bounty hunter. He has a warrant for a woman named Elara Vance. For murder." He didn't ask. He stated it as a fact, an accusation. "Is it true?" The question was a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to explain, to tell him about the man she'd worked for, his heavy hands and cruel whispers, the night he'd cornered her in the cellar, the struggle, the heavy candlestick in her hand. It was her life or his. She had chosen hers. But how could she explain that to this man, whose face was a wall of judgment? The truth was a complicated, ugly thing, and all he wanted was a simple yes or no. "There's a warrant," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. It was the only truth she could give him. She saw the last flicker of warmth in his eyes die. He had been betrayed. He had opened a door, just a crack, and a viper had slithered in. "I want you gone," he said, his voice lethally quiet. "Before morning." He turned and walked away, each step a hammer blow to her heart. He didn't look back. She stood there, her hand still resting on Shadow's neck, until the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood. The horse nudged her gently, as if sensing her desolation. This place, this man, had been a dream of a life she could have, but she had always been destined to wake up. That night she packed her few meager belongings into a small bundle. The heavy wool coat he had given her lay on the cot. She picked it up, burying her face in it one last time, breathing in his scent. She folded it carefully and left it at the foot of the bed. She couldn't take it with her. She wrote a short, simple note on a piece of scrap paper. I'm sorry. It was all she had to say. Under the cold light of a sliver of moon, she slipped out of the shack. She went to the corral, not Shadow's, but the one with the quarter horses. She chose a sturdy mare, one she had often tended. It felt like a betrayal, stealing from him, but her life depended on it. As she led the horse out, Shadow began to pace in his corral, letting out a low, mournful nicker. It was a sound of goodbye. Ilara swung into the saddle, turned the mare east, and rode away from the only home she had ever known, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving darkness. When the sun rose, Silas felt the wrongness of the day before he was even fully awake. The silence from the north pasture was different. It was a hollow, empty silence. He walked to the line shack, a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The door was ajar. The shack was neat, clean, and utterly empty, save for his coat, folded on the cot. On the table was the note. 2 words. I'm sorry. He sank onto the cot, the note crushing in his fist. He had done this. He had pushed her away. He had seen the terror and desperation in her eyes and chosen to believe the word of a stranger in a saloon over the evidence of his own heart. He thought of her gentleness with the calf, her courage with the stallion, the quiet strength in her hands. Murderers were not built that way. He had been so afraid of being hurt again that he had become the one who hurt. The cold shell he had lived in for years felt like a tomb, and he had just willingly locked himself back inside. The loneliness that washed over him was a physical force, a tidal wave of regret that threatened to drown him. The ranch had never felt so empty. Finch was patient. He knew the woman would run, and he knew a woman alone on the prairie was easy prey. He let the rumor of his presence do its work, flushing her out into the open. He picked up her trail an hour after dawn, the tracks of a single-shod horse heading east. He smiled. This was the easy part. Ilara rode hard, pushing the mare, not daring to look back. She knew the bounty hunter would be coming. Her only hope was to reach the river and follow it north into the rough country where she might lose him. The land was flat and open, offering no cover. She felt exposed, a single, scurrying creature under the watchful eye of a hawk. By midday, she saw him. A black speck on the horizon behind her, slowly growing larger. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She urged the mare faster, but the horse was already tiring. The speck grew into a rider, a man who moved with relentless, predatory purpose. Back at the ranch, Silas stood on his porch, staring east. The emptiness of the place was screaming at him. Jed approached, his face etched with concern. "Boss? You all right?" Silas looked at his foreman, the man who had served him loyally for 20 years. "I was wrong, Jed," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was a damn fool." He turned and strode toward the barn without another word. He went straight to Shadow's stall. The stallion was agitated, pacing, sensing his master's turmoil. For the first time since his wife's death, Silas saddled the black stallion. The horse fought him for a moment, then submitted, as if he understood. As if he had been waiting. Silas swung into the saddle, the powerful animal moving under him like coiled lightning. He rode out of the yard at a gallop, kicking up a storm of dust heading east. He didn't know what he would do, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could not live in a world where he had let her face the darkness alone. Finch caught up to her at the river crossing. The water was shallow but wide, the banks muddy. The mare stumbled, exhausted. Ilara knew she was trapped. She slid from the saddle, turning to face him, her back to the water. Finch dismounted, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He drew his pistol. "Ilara Vance. Been a long time comin'. The man in Kansas. It was self-defense," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He attacked me." "Doesn't matter to me," Finch sneered, leveling the gun at her chest. "Story's easier if you resist arrest. The reward's the same, dead or alive." He was going to murder her in cold blood. She closed her eyes, a prayer forming on her lips. A single sharp crack of a rifle echoed across the plain. The pistol flew from Finch's hand, and he yelped, clutching his stinging fingers. Both he and Alara stared in stunned disbelief as Silas Blackwood rode into view on the black stallion, a smoking rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Shadow was a magnificent, terrifying sight, his eyes wild, his presence radiating controlled power. He looked like vengeance itself. Silas dismounted, his movements fluid and dangerous. He walked to stand between Alara and the bounty hunter. He didn't look at her, but she felt the force of his presence like a shield. "She's under my protection," Silas said, his voice a low growl that promised violence. Finch stared, incredulous. "Blackwood? What's this to you? She's a wanted murderer. Harboring her makes you an outlaw." Silas's lips pulled back in a humorless smile. "Then I guess I'm an outlaw." He had chosen, publicly, irreversibly. He was choosing her over his reputation, over the law, over everything. Finch, enraged and humiliated, lunged for the pistol lying in the mud. His sudden movement spooked his own horse. The animal reared violently, its hoof catching Finch in the chest and sending him sprawling backward. He landed with a sickening crack, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He screamed, a raw, agonized sound, clutching his shattered limb. His horse, terrified, bolted and ran. Finch was left helpless, bleeding in the mud, his face pale with shock and pain. Silas stood, rifle ready, his expression grim. Alara looked at the pathetic, broken man on the ground, the man who had hunted her and was about to kill her without a second thought. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to take this chance, and disappear forever. But that wasn't who she was. She looked at Silas, at the choice he had just made for her, and she knew she had to make one of her own. She walked past him, knelt beside the groaning bounty hunter, and tore a long strip from the hem of her worn dress. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, his voice rough with confusion. "He'll bleed to death if I don't stop it," she said simply. Her hands, once raw from farm work, were now deft and sure. She tied a tourniquet above the wound, her touch gentle despite the revulsion she felt. Finch stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and pain. She found 2 sturdy pieces of driftwood and, with a grimace, set the bone as best she could, splinting it tightly with more strips of her dress. She saved his life. In that moment, with her enemy's life literally in her hands, she showed Silas the truth of her soul. It was not the soul of a murderer. It was the soul of a healer. Silas watched her, his heart aching with a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had come to rescue her, but in the end, her quiet act of mercy had rescued him from the last of his doubt, from the cold prison of his past. He saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. They took Finch back to redemption, tied to his own saddle. Silas sent a wire to the territorial marshal in the capital, a man he knew and trusted, demanding a full and fair inquiry into the Kansas warrant and citing the bounty hunter's clear intent to kill. He used the full weight of his name and his influence, something he hadn't done for anyone in years. He was fighting for her. Weeks turned into a month. Alara stayed at the ranch, but not in the line shack. Silas had insisted she take a room in the main house. The space between them was charged with everything that had happened, all the words they still hadn't said. He was hesitant, afraid of pushing her. She was cautious, afraid of hoping. The news, when it came, was better than they'd dared to dream. The marshal's investigation had uncovered the truth. The landowner in Kansas had a reputation for cruelty, especially toward his female staff. Another servant, long since fled, came forward to corroborate Alara's story. The warrant was nullified. Finch was exposed as a fraud, working for the landowner's vengeful family, not the law. He would face his own justice. She was free. The past was finally, truly, dead. That evening, Ilara stood on the porch, watching the sunset. The sky was a riot of orange and purple. She was no longer a ghost, no longer running. She had a name again. Ilara. But she didn't know what came next. She was free to go anywhere. The thought should have been liberating, but it felt like a loss. Silas came to stand beside her. They watched the last sliver of sun disappear in silence. "You're free to leave, Ilara," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You can go anywhere you want." She turned to look at him. His face, once so hard and closed, was open to her now. The winter in his eyes had thawed, replaced by a warmth that was entirely for her. "What if I don't want to go anywhere?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if the only place I want to be is here?" He finally did what he had wanted to do for months. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I spent years building fences around this ranch," he said, his voice raw. "But the highest walls were the ones I built around myself. You, Ilara, you walked right through them without even trying. This place, it was just land and lumber before you came. You made it a home again." He searched her eyes. "Don't leave. Stay. Stay and build a life with me." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief and joy. She leaned into his touch, her hand covering his. "I'm not a farmhand, Silas," she whispered with a small smile. "No," he agreed, his own smile finally reaching his eyes, transforming his face. "You're the owner." He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but of quiet certainty, a promise of slow sunrises and shared silences, of healing and belonging. It was a kiss that tasted of home. The dust and the running were over. The kingdom was hers. The most powerful man in the territory had needed her, and in saving each other, they had found everything. The frontier was still wild, but here, on this porch, in his arms, she had found her shelter.